on understanding the times. And a few weeks ago, we were talking about the two Babylons that you read in the book of Revelation. One you find in Revelation 17. The other you find in Revelation chapter 18. And tonight we're really going to focus on the Babylon that we read about in chapter number 17. So let me turn my mic on here. And let me say, while I'm doing that, I'm on. Yeah, I'm on now. But I do appreciate Brother Jim and the others who've been fooling with these mics. As you noticed, occasionally it's been cutting out, and we're trying to, one thing at a time, eliminate what's causing the trouble. But we've tried something new tonight. We'll see how well it works. But I do appreciate all the effort and the time that's gone into trying to make this work. But like I said, last time we talked about both Revelation 17 and 18, the fact that there are two Babylons that are mentioned there. One is what is often referred to as ecclesiastical Babylon or religious Babylon, and then the second one is economic Babylon. And so tonight we're really going to focus more on chapter 17. But as we do that, once again, let's remember this is kind of the general flow of the book of the Revelation, and especially the tribulation period. You have the rapture of the church, then you have that 7-year interval known as the tribulation. At the midpoint, a lot of stuff happens. We've talked about all those different things over the course of our study. And then the last half of the tribulation is known as the Great Tribulation, because the judgments during that period, as we've talked about, really seem to ramp up, and there's a lot of stuff going on. Then after that, you have the return of Christ at the Battle of Armageddon. You have the defeat of the Antichrist, and then Christ sets up his millennial kingdom. So that's the big picture flow of the tribulation period that we read about and we study in the book of the Revelation. Now, we've talked about the things that we're going to be talking about, and we talked about the beast and the Antichrist. We finished that, the false prophet. We talked about the mark of the beast, and now we're talking about mystery or ecclesiastical Babylon, and then next time we'll talk more about economic Babylon, and then we'll talk about the 5 judgments, and then the last days and how it all kind of correlates with some of the things that you read and what's often referred to as the Olivet Discourse that you find in Matthew 24 and 25 that Christ taught the disciples there on the Mount of Olives. Now, as we've talked about, when you talk about much of the book of the Revelation, but especially here when you're talking about the two Babylons, there are a lot of theories. Some people see it as a literal Rome in chapter 17 and a literal rebuilt city of Babylon in chapter 18. Rome will be the religious center. Babylon will be the commercial center, as we talked about a few moments ago. And that particular theory really took off for several years during the time of Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein attempted to rebuild Babylon. And of course it never really took off. There are a few things there that were constructed, but even now they're falling apart with the latest pictures and those kind of things. But that particular theory really took off, especially during the time of Saddam Hussein when he was ruling there in Iraq. Then there is the Rome-only theory. This does, as we'll see here in just a few moments, fit the 7 mountains or the 7 hills description that you see in this chapter, because Rome was known as the city of the 7 hills. But there also seems to be some prophecies that might indicate that something is going on in Babylon, so we'll have to address that. But then on the other side of things, when you read chapter 17 and 18, and you have to keep in mind that when the majority of the Bible was written, it was not written with chapters and verses. The only exception to that really is the Psalms. And because each of those Psalms is a song, and because of that, they had verses. But the rest of the Bible, the verses and the chapters were added by Stephanus in the 1500s, and he added those things. And if you read chapter 17 and chapter 18, and you kind of ignore the chapter divisions, and you just read the text, it really does flow as if it's talking about a single place. So for a lot of reasons, people will say that it's really just talking about Rome. Then you've got and like I said, these are just my thoughts on it. It's a literal Rome and a literal Babylon, or it's Rome only. Over time, and I'll tell you more about this when we get into chapter number 18, which one I really lean the strongest toward, and why I really do believe it's really Rome only, but we'll talk about the nuances tonight, and then, like I said, next time as well. But as we get into this, let's just read chapter number 17. And there came one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-covered beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. The angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, one is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. The 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Now, that last verse, just by itself, along with the 7 hills reference, or the 7 mountains reference, pretty much helps us identify right out of the bat that we're talking about Rome here. All right? At least Rome as the city where these events occur. And so that we can kind of immediately say is the case. But I want to take just a minute and talk about what the Bible means when it's talking about the word mystery. In this case, it's not a title, as if she's wearing the name mystery. Instead, it's basically a call for us to pay attention because something's different and something special is going on here. It signifies, at least in this case, that this is not a literal Babylon, but it's a symbolic reference. Okay? Like I said, it's clear that we're talking about Rome. The 7 hills reference, and then, like I said, that last verse where it talks about the city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. That's the Roman Empire. Rome was the center of that empire. So the idea of mystery here is not a title. Instead, what it is a call to pay attention that John is giving a descriptive element here, and that it's symbolic and not literal Babylon there in the plain of Shinar in Iraq. What we know about this whore that we're talking about, or the harlot, what we know about her is this. This judgment that we read about in chapter 17 is on the whore, right? It even tells us that very, very plainly. It says, verse number 1, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. So this isn't a judgment of the beast, per se. This is not a judgment of the Antichrist. This is a judgment of what is being described here as this harlot or this whore. And that's very important to note as we go through this. The whore is identified as surrounded by wealth. It talks about the fine clothing that she's wearing and the pearls and all of the things that she's decked in. It tells us that she's the source of blasphemy. Now that's really, really interesting, and we're going to come back to that in just a minute, but look at it again. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. The word mother there means the originator, okay? The originator of harlots and abominations of the earth. So she is the source of blasphemy, all right? She influences, this harlot influences all the nations, according to verse 16. She'll be destroyed by the 10 kings that she's actually riding to power on in the early part of the chapter. It's these 10 kings that destroy her. This is not, it's God's judgment because it says he puts into their hearts to destroy the city. But it is not a supernatural judgment in the sense of things falling out of the heavens or anything like that. You're going to see that in chapter number 18. But in chapter number 17, the Bible says that this harlot or this whore is actually, God uses these 10 kings that she's ridden to power on to actually be the source of her judgment. It's a city, like we said, that sits on 7 mountains or 7 hills. And again, that would have been easily recognized in the day that John wrote as saying this was talking about Rome. Because like I said, it was known even in that day as the city of the 7 hills. The fact that the city is described as a whore and again is tied to blasphemy ties it to religion. Okay? Blasphemy is a religion that is in opposition to the things of God. And she's called the source or the mother, like I said, of blasphemy. But you have to ask yourself the question, why not just say Rome? Why does it talk about Babylon here? And why is that the description that's used? Well, if you go back through history, you understand quite a few things. First of all, Babylon itself was the original Babylon, was built upon the same ruins and in the same area as the Tower of Babel that you read about in Genesis chapter number 10. Babel was the first religious rebellion against God. Remember what happened as far as after the flood. Remember what happened. God protects Noah and his family. They come off the ark. He tells them to multiply and to spread across and fill the earth. And the people refuse to do that. And instead, they build this tower, the Bible says, unto heaven. And we have to understand that kind of has a double meaning, or has 2 different kind of perspectives. One, it was a very tall tower. Secondly, it was a tower unto or in honor of the heavens. Okay? And that's key to understanding some of the other things that go on with this. But Babel was the source or the original first rebellion after the religious rebellion after the flood. It was later tied to idolatry with the Queen of Heaven. And that Queen of Heaven originated with and out of Babel or Babylon. Go with me to Jeremiah chapter number 7. Jeremiah chapter number 7. Jeremiah chapter number 7 and verse number 18, the Bible says this. The children gather wood, and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead their dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. This Queen of Heaven was known originally in Babylon, or in the Tower of Babel in that time period, as Ishtar, which was later kind of over the cultures changed to Astarte and Asherah and several other names over the course of the history of that idol, but it actually originated there in Babylon. And then in Jeremiah chapter number 44, just a few chapters over, you see another string of references to the same thing, starting in verses 17. Jeremiah 44, verse 17. But we will certainly do whatsoever thing goeth forth out of our own mouth, to burn incense unto the Queen of heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings, and our princes, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then had we plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil. But since we left off to burn incense to the Queen of heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, we have wanted all things, and have been consumed by the sword and by the famine. And then in verse 19, and when we burned incense to the Queen of heaven and poured out drink offerings unto her, did we make her cakes to worship her and pour out drink offerings unto her without our men. Basically, the children of Israel are about to be judged. Excuse me, I'm trying to adjust this thing on my ear. I wanted to move outside. There we go. That's the problem. There we go. What was going on is Jerusalem was about to be overtaken by Nebuchadnezzar at this point in time in history. And, of course, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. And the people were basically saying here, as long as we were worshiping the gods of Babylon, we were okay. When we tried to reform and do the things the way God wanted us to do, we've been in trouble ever since. And so that's basically the charge of the people here. And then in verse number 25, it continues on. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, Ye and your wives have both spoken with your mouths and fulfilled with your hands, saying, We will surely perform our vows that we have vowed, to burn incense to the Queen of heaven and to pour out drink offerings unto her. We will surely accomplish your vows. You will surely accomplish your vows and surely perform your vows. And what God's saying is, if that's who you're going to worship, then I'm going to let them take over so you ain't got any choice but to worship there. So Babylon has always been seen as ultimately the enemy of the people of God when it comes to worship. Jeremiah 51 verses 7 through 8, again, talking about literal Babylon there during the days of Nebuchadnezzar, was described, again, in very similar language to what you read about in Revelation. Jeremiah chapter number 51, verses 7 and 8. Babylon hath been made a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her, take balm for her pain, if so be she may be healed. So again, you see this idea of a golden cup. You see people being drunk on the things that she has to offer. And so that's why you see that same imagery in the Old Testament. It's a picture of the enemies of God, and now that enemy has transferred itself to the city of Rome. The early church, when you study history and you look back at the early writings right after the apostles, the apostolic fathers, all of them saw this as a reference to Rome. The reformers and the Puritans saw it as referring to Rome. And they saw it and understood it to be a symbol of both debauchery and destruction. And so Babylon is the picture, ultimately, of false religion. Like I said, it goes back to the earliest days of Babel. The harlot imagery in the Old Testament was used to describe false religion and political power over and over again. You see it used to describe Nineveh in the book of Nahum. You see it used to describe the city of Tyre in Isaiah. And you see it again being referred to directly to Babylon in Ezekiel 23:17. So when the book of the Revelation actually uses here this imagery of Babylon as a religious harlot, what it's doing is talking about the false religion of the last days. Now, here's what's interesting, and this is where I wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time here. The harlot rides to unprecedented power on the back of the last days empire. It's what it tells us here, back in Revelation chapter number 17. She's riding the beast All right? So this is the last days empire. And she's riding to her ultimate expression of power. Now ask yourself the question, what is, when you look at it from a big picture standpoint, what is the largest religious influence in Rome? The Roman Catholic Church. And when you look at the description, and you have to understand that John's writing both at what he is seeing and what is coming and what is about to happen. And he's talking about this false religious system seated in Rome at the height of its power throughout history, and especially in the last days empire that we've talked about with the beast and the false prophet and the 10 kings that give their power to him. And so it's pretty clear that at least the basis of the last days religious system is going to have its seat in Rome and will be predominantly Roman Catholic. That's not to say, I mean, right now, I don't know if y'all saw this just happened this week. Did you all see where Pope, his name just left me. Francis, thank you. I had Florence on the brain. I knew that wasn't right, and it just was not coming out. But Pope Francis just donated a huge sum of money to help take care of immigrants at our border. The political power, Rome has always had, the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church has always had a tremendous amount of political power. As a matter of fact, during the Middle Ages, and especially during that time, if you were going to be king, you basically had to have the blessing of the Roman Catholic Church. And so there's always been this tight connection between Rome and political power, and there's always been this connection between Rome and false worship. If you go back and you look at the history, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not about bashing people, but I'm just telling you the system of Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, is not biblical. As a matter of fact, it is completely against what the Bible says. We were in Israel on our first or second trip. I can't remember. Which one was it when they busted that hole in the floor of that store and you could see street level at the time of Christ? Was that the one with Don? So anyway, we were on the Via Dolorosa, the path that Christ would have taken to the cross. And we went into this shop. And I got the biggest shock that I guess I've ever seen in my life. And that was that hanging on the walls of this store, because it was a tourist place, and we were in there, looking for kitschy stuff, but hanging on the walls of this store were crucifixes. Now we're all familiar with crucifixes. The difference between a cross and a crucifix is that with a crucifix, Christ is still on the cross. That's a very Roman Catholic symbol. Okay, and so here you had these normal crucifixes everywhere. But there were also crosses that had Mary hanging on the cross, holding Jesus on. The Roman Catholic Church, especially under Pope John Paul II, he came from Poland. And the Polish Catholicism was very, very much centered upon Mary, much more even really than Christ. And Pope John Paul II, during his time as Pope, actually produced an encyclical, which is kind of like a church formal letter, that basically called Mary the co-redemptrix with Christ. In other words, you can't be saved by what Jesus did. You are saved by what Jesus and Mary did. And the reason that's important is it goes back to this Queen of Heaven reference. Remember, it said that she was the mother or the source of all, harlotry or blasphemy. If you go back to the Queen of Heaven reference, you'll find out that it takes you back to Babylon, and she had a son, the Queen of Heaven. Oftentimes, sometimes you'll see her referred to as Semiramis. Most of the time, it's Ishtar or some of the other names. And you see this same symbology in the Egyptian false religions. You see it in Greek false religions. You see it in the Roman false religion of that area, of the whole Middle East and the Mediterranean. And it's this idea of a woman and a child. And the child is usually in the form of a baby. Where does that look familiar? And you find it in Babylon with Ishtar and her son, Tammuz. And as a matter of fact, I meant to look that up today, and I forgot. Give me just 1 second here, and I'll show you the scripture verse that actually talks about Tammuz. Don't you hate it when you know where everything is on your phone except when you need it? There we go. All right. Ezekiel chapter number 8. Ezekiel chapter number 8. Again, we're talking about the idolatry of Israel during this time of the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian siege of the city. But in Ezekiel chapter number 8 and verse 14, you see the child. And it says, let's back up to verse 13. Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 13. He said also unto me, turn thee yet again. And God's showing Ezekiel all the idolatry of the people. And he said unto me, turn thou yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations that they do. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was towards the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. That's the child in the woman and child imagery. In Egypt, it's Osiris and Isis and Osiris, and you go through the ancient Middle East and all of those things, and the Mediterranean, and you see this same thing, just different names. And then you see it brought into, and the Roman Catholic Church doesn't even have any problem admitting this, that the way that they got peoples in different countries to fall into Christian worship was to use pagan symbols as a means of getting them, and they would just Christianize the pagan symbols to make people want to be willing to worship. And you see that same imagery with Mary and the child, because you always see it almost always in that context. But like I said, when you really get into the Roman Catholic doctrine, they point blank tell you that you are not saved by grace alone. You are saved, you're saved because of Christ, but you're saved because of Christ and Mary and what you do, by works. And there's a lot of things that are tied into all of those things. I've definitely not got the time to get into all of that tonight. So you see this calling here that it says this false church during the time of the tribulation rides to its highest power on the back of these 10 nations. But then something happens. In Revelation 17, starting in verse number 15. And he saith unto me, the waters which thou sawest where the whore sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. Again, the Roman Catholic Church is worldwide. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. So the 10 nations that give their power to the Antichrist do that after they've destroyed the harlot. That's what that says. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I've taught prophecy and been involved with prophecy for 30 years. And that's the first time I noticed that it said there that they give their power, they destroy the harlot so that they can give their power to the beast or give their power to the Antichrist. And what that means, ultimately, what that means is that the Roman Catholic Church and all the false religions that are a part of that at that time, and that'll be kind of incorporated. Remember, the Muslim faith is going to be decimated at the Battle of Gog and Magog. And so all the false religions will kind of be syncretized under the Roman Catholic umbrella. There have already, it was, I think, under Pope John Paul II, they had a meeting of all the world's biggest religious leaders, including the Dalai Lama. He had them all at the Vatican to pray for peace for the world. Now, here's what's intriguing about that, is that it was all the religions of the world. One of them was the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama in Tibetan Buddhism is God. And he was there praying for peace, along with all the other religions of the world. So that kind of thing is not unprecedented. But what this says is that this false religious system, primarily centered in the Roman Catholic Church, will be destroyed at the midpoint when the beasts when the kings give their power to the beast. Not, most people, when they read chapter 17 and chapter number 18, they think that this destruction happens near the end of the tribulation. But the destruction of the false church happens at the midpoint. Now, why is that important? And how in the world, as I finally it hit me, the first question that went through my mind is how in the world did you miss that for so long? And here's the reason. Why would they destroy the church at the midpoint? Well, what else happens at the midpoint? The Antichrist sets himself up as God. Now, even if you say that the Roman Catholic Church is very much corrupt, they still say that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, as corrupt as the religious system is with the works and Mary and all that other stuff, they still say that Jesus is the Son of God and that he died on the cross for people's sins. If the Roman Catholic Church still existed when the Antichrist sets himself up as God in the temple, then they're going to push back because it totally destroys their religion. So the false church of the book of Revelation is destroyed not at the end, but in the middle, when the 10 kings give their power to the Antichrist. And then, without the false church in the way, he sets himself up as God in the temple. Now, when we get to chapter 18, that destruction of that Babylon, and we'll talk about it next time, does happen at the end. And there's a way to see it. So what you see in chapter 17 and 18 is this. There is the destruction of the false church at the midpoint, and the destruction of the economic Babylon is at the end. Which again makes sense, because what does the Antichrist do at the midpoint? He institutes what? The mark of the beast. So, 17 is the destruction of the false church, predominantly based in Roman Catholicism. It's destroyed at the midpoint, and then at the end of the tribulation, economic Babylon's destroyed. And that's what we'll talk about next time. Comments or questions? Now, here's the thing. I told Sabrina, I said, I have studied prophecy for 30 years, and I said, I have never seen anybody say that. And that bothers me. I mean, it really does. So I went back and I was flipping through all of my commentaries, and I came back to this one, The End Times in Chronological Order. And let me read you something here. And when I read this, I was a happy camper. 127. Let's see. If I can find it, because I read it last night. I thought it was so interesting because I'd missed that in this book. Let's see. Well, I was going to read it. But anyway, it's in there because I read it last night. But anyway, in here, he actually says exactly the same thing, and for exactly the same reason. That the reason that the false church is destroyed at the midpoint is so that the way is cleared for the Antichrist to declare himself to be God. And let's see. Now, give me 1 second. I meant to mark this last night, but it was late when I found it. I'll find it and I'll read it to you next week. The longer I'm looking for it, the madder I'm getting. But trust me, I actually did find somebody and actually found another person who agreed that this happens at the midpoint. So long story short, chapter 17 is the destruction of the false church, which clears the way for the Antichrist to declare himself God at the midpoint. And then from there, economic Babylon kicks in. And again, this is important because, like I said, religious Babylon or the false church is destroyed by the 10 kings. Economic Babylon will be destroyed directly as a judgment of God, where the 10 kings were just used by God. God uses supernatural events to destroy the economic Babylon in 18. I'm going to read you something in chapter 18 that ought to show you the wickedness of the world system. There's a verse in there that the first time I saw this and paid attention to it, it absolutely broke my heart. So next time when we're in chapter 18, I'll read you that verse and explain why that's such an important verse, okay? Any questions or comments? Any questions or comments? Yes, sir. There's nothing in Scripture that specifically says. I mean, basically what it says is they rend her to pieces. I mean, it's basically what it's saying there in a nutshell. And so basically, it will not only be a destruction of her wealth, but it will also be a destruction of her influence. That being the case, and with it talking about her seated in Rome, seated on the 7 hills, you can guarantee that the religious leaders, the bishops and the archbishops and probably the Pope and everything else, all of the religious leaders centered there in Rome will be killed as part of that destruction. And then there will be no head. And so that destroys the influence, and then those 10 kingdoms will just absorb the wealth, is kind of what it seems to indicate. Somebody else? Somebody else? All right, like I said, next time we'll pick up with chapter number 18. We'll talk about economic Babylon, and like I said, I'm going to show you something there that ought to just shock us. If you really want to know more, like I said, I always try to let you know about a lot of good resources that are out there. I think this book is still in print. If not, I know you can get it on Amazon or anything like that. But this is Dave Hunt, A Woman Rides the Beast. And anything Dave Hunt writes is documented to the hilt. He's been dead now for a few years. The last time, matter of fact, I got to see him at the last prophecy conference that he attended and taught at. But this book's called A Woman Rides the Beast, and it documents the history that I gave you a really brief overview of the Roman Catholic Church, how it's tied to this ancient history of Babylon and the influence of the Roman Catholic Church and politics and all that kind of stuff. This is a fantastic book if you're interested in that understanding of chapter number 17. Any other comments or questions? Father, we love you and we thank you for the truth of your word.